We're in the section on the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is talking about and contrasting the teachings that were given regarding the Old Testament law with what they and explaining what they really mean versus how traditions had developed about what they meant. So now we are at everybody's favorite topic today, the section that deals with adultery. Jesus said, "You have heard it said of old, thou shalt not commit adultery." Now, what did you call me, Kenny Kaplan, a few years ago? The Dr. Ruth of Sunday school teachers, was that your phrase? All right. I don't want any grief. Of course, not that that matters. I'm going to get it anyway, I'm sure. But this is a topic that it needs to be addressed, and I think it's always needed to be addressed, and in some respects more so these days. So in verse 27 of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, "You have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery." You shall not commit adultery. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell." So he brings up here, of course, the next commandment. Last week he was talking about murder. This week he talks, or the previous section, last week we looked at the one where he said, "Thou shalt not commit murder," and what is really involved in that. So, this passage is in a lot of ways probably one of the more problematic and misunderstood passages, certainly in the sermon on the entire Sermon on the Mount, if not in the New Testament, because I've heard this expounded on a lot of different ways, and very extreme efforts taken by people in order to follow what Jesus says. So we go back to the commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Pretty straightforward, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. Seems pretty simple, doesn't it? You know, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." So, of course, what becomes the first question that gets asked?
What's adultery?
What's adultery? What constitutes adultery? And by the time of Jesus, of course, just like in our views today, there's this wide expanse. And so what some of the Jewish leaders said was basically anything that was sexual in nature constitutes adultery. Where others were saying, no, adultery is very narrow and specific. And anything that doesn't fall in the narrow and specific is permitted. And so you have this wide range. Now, this passage also follows, Jesus goes on then to talk about divorce, and he ties it to marriage, and that we'll be looking at. Now, people have struggled with this, and I understand that there could be some struggle as to what Jesus is actually saying. And I certainly grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist culture that said merely noticing that someone was attractive was as bad as committing adultery with them. So you didn't even notice whether somebody, it was sinful the minute you said, "Oh, she's cute." Oh, wow. You're committing adultery now in your heart. And that's not what Jesus is saying. Now, we are obviously living in a culture, not unlike lots of others in the world, that has reduced beauty to the erotic and eroticizes everything. And so the minute you say somebody is attractive or you noticed something, bam, it's immediately got a sexual connotation to it. And that is to our detriment. Now, let me ask you this. How many of you looked in a mirror this morning before you left home? About a third of you, okay. Why did you look in the mirror? Were you doubting your existence? Did you want to see if you became a vampire overnight? Why'd you look in the mirror? To see if you were awake. Through your squinty eyes, you're like, who's that old guy looking back at me? That's what I think a lot of times. Why'd you look in the mirror?
See if you're presentable.
Remind myself of work to do.
Come on, why'd you look in the mirror? What difference does it make? Did you adjust? By the way, did any of you adjust anything looking in the mirror? I'd ask the question, how many of you ladies have worn out a mirror in your bathroom, but I don't Go ahead. You think I spend a lot of time looking in there? This is what always gets me. Shelley gets dressed on Sunday morning, comes out, and then wants my opinion as to whether, she looks okay. I buy my clothes mostly at Fleet Farm. This is a place that sells bulk tractor oil and tire chains. You really think I have a fashion sense? I mean, why does she spend her life walking around with a half-tamed orangutan? Why does she care? But right, we look because we're concerned about how we appear, right? So if I look at a lady in church, any one of you, I pick you out and I go, hey, Barb, you look like $1 million today. Is that an appropriate or inappropriate comment?
Are you asking me or?
No. No, Jerry, does she look like $1 million today? Absolutely. Is that an appropriate comment or an inappropriate comment?
Depends on who's here.
Why does it depend? What does it depend on? How many Gen Zers are? Why? Because $1 million is pocket change to them? Or? Oh, well, that. Hey, I'm in the room. That will offend Gen Zers, okay? See, there's a time and there's certain cultures where you don't dare tell anybody they look good because it is immediately given an erotic connotation. So, people say, gee, you sound like a creepy old guy when you say that. No, all I'm doing is acknowledging what you have spent a lot of time working on anyway, and if you hadn't, you wouldn't have looked in the mirror. Right? You put some effort into your appearance today, right? Jerry, did Barb wake up looking like this?
Yep.
Oh. Jerry, never say I ever did anything for you. I lost your softball on that one. Knock that one out. So, the better translation, because of the words that Jesus uses in this passage, is this. It is whoever looks at a woman in order to lust is guilty of adultery. And so there are different Greek words for adultery, for fornication, and what constitutes what. There's different words. But what Jesus is talking about here is not just seeing someone saying, wow, she looks nice, or for that matter, he looks good. That's not what he's talking about. It is not just recognizing beauty. It is the idea that you look at someone, or quite frankly, something, because of what he does later on, in order to develop the desire. In order to develop desire. Now, what's wrong with looking at someone in order to develop the desire?
It gets into covetousness.
Gets into covetousness. Yes, exactly. Now, of course, in a sense, part of what he's talking about, and it's interesting because the word that he uses there in order to develop desire is the Greek word porneia, from which we get the English word pornography. So yeah, here it is, springboard right into the anti-pornography sermon, which is the easiest sermon in the world you can possibly preach, because what could be said good about pornography? Nothing, right? Its intent is to develop desire. This is where in, 1968, 1969, Richard Nixon, elected president in 68, does a presidential commission on the study of pornography, because there were pornography lawsuits stemmed back to, could the U.S. Mail Service deliver Playboy magazines? Because there's a prohibition against the mail service, the U.S. Mail Service handling lewd, lascivious, or something else. I forget what the regulation says. They can't deliver lewd, lascivious, or pornographic material. So the question was, did this qualify as pornography? Could this magazine? So the president develops a commission. Supreme Court winds up having to hear a case on this. So, forget who the justices were. One of the guys was just about blind. Might have been Earl Warren. But anyway, one of the guys on the Supreme Court, eyesight's bad, but what they have to do is come up with a definition of pornography. And so they have to look at a lot of stuff to say, is this pornographic or not? So this is just an amusing side note. This justice who couldn't see, so they were not only looking at printed material, they watched movies. So there's a theater, they go down to this theater in the basement of the Supreme Court building, and they're putting movies up. But the justice can't see the screen. So he has to have a clerk sit next to him and describe what's going on the screen. How'd you like that job? So they have this challenge, they gotta come up with a definition of what constitutes pornography. And they can't do it. And the famous statement that comes by a Supreme Court justice out of this is, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And so that's where what they did was they came up with the prevailing community standard. So what constitutes pornography in Two Harbors may not be the same thing that constitutes pornography in San Francisco. And now this, what are we, 50 some years later, it's all kind of irrelevant, because what was pornographic in the late 60s is now commonplace advertising today, right? You see it on billboards now, there's no question about that. And so there is we got to get away from the idea that any recognition of beauty has implicit within it an acknowledgement of the erotic. That is not what Jesus is talking about here. What he's talking about is when we look in order to develop lust. And what is lust?
Unbridled or uncontrolled sexual desire.
Yeah, well, that's how we normally, that's on the notes, yeah. Unbridled sexual desire, but technically lust isn't just to the erotic. That's how we use it. But it can be desire for anything. When it is an unbridled, uncontrolled desire for something or someone that you have no business having in any context, that's what lust. And so he's talking here about lust. So he ties adultery, the commandment, the E-R-Y, you should know how to spell it anyway, with lust or desire. Simple desire. Is desire the problem?
No.
We have one brave no. Yeah, desire by itself isn't the problem. Even within Christianity and people talking about this passage, they will make it sound like desire is the problem. If we could just get rid of the desire, then we wouldn't have the problem, right? Well, no. What he talks about is the undirected, the inordinate desire and inappropriate desire. Desire by itself for anything isn't the issue. if you could live a desire-free life, you would lead a life, you know, presumably without being attracted to sin, but you know what else you wouldn't be attracted to?
Anything.
Anything. It would be a bland, boring existence without desire. So desire by itself is not the issue. It's what we do with the desire that then becomes the issue and the challenge for us. And so Jesus goes on to talk about this. And it is the either enticing, dressing, looking, acting at someone in order to develop the desire within you, or the flip side, dressing, acting, behaving in such a manner as to desire other, to have raise the desire in other people. And so this is where it becomes a two-sided thing. Mrs. Anderson.
I don't know the answer to that, that's why I'm asking it.
All right.
Pharisees and Sadducees, could they only have one wife, or could they have multiple wives and concubines? Because I think they could get around it and then, you know, make excuses in desire and lust and, did they just have one wife? Was that, I don't know. That I don't mean successive ones, because one died, I mean at a time.
Yes. There again, there were different schools of thought. So there were those that said, you know, as long as it wasn't sexual intercourse, penetrative sex taking place, whatever you did with anyone was okay. There were others that said, you know, absolutely nothing sexual, erotic was permissible other than with your wife. Now, were they serial monogamists? Well, I'm sure you found, just like now, you found the whole particular spectrum, I'm sure, within it.
But they could marry more than one woman at a time?
I don't know offhand if polygamy, it had pretty much, just off the top of my head, I can't think of a passage in the New Testament or an example in the New Testament of polygamy. Polygamy, yeah, probably pretty much died out. I mean, obviously there was polygamy in the Old Testament. You don't even have to go all the way back to the beginning. You find it at the other end of the Old Testament, the later end. So, was it practiced? Was it common? Was it, I don't know offhand, but I'm guessing by and large, no. Partly because keeping multiple wives is very expensive. And so, well, that was one of the reasons within cultures that there was polygamy, because it was a way that you said, look how wealthy I am. I can afford to keep 2 or 3 or 4 women. And so it was a demonstration of wealth and status. And so that was one of the reasons it was done. So Jesus is not here saying, you know, don't even recognize the beauty of another person. Just turn your eyes. Just don't do it. He doesn't give us a new law here. Now, people have taken this within the history of Christianity, not just Christianity, but certainly Christianity. Have any of you ever been around Christian groups or denominations where when you come to church, the women all sit on one side, the men all sit on the other? Yeah, some of you have, I have. It's an interesting thing when you show up to preach, you know, and all the women are here, all the men are here. So that can happen. So what's the rationale for that?
Distraction.
Avoids distraction, supposedly limits temptation, you know, so, well, is putting the women all on one side and the men on the other really going to eliminate distraction?
No, probably.
No, so you should put a screen up between the two sections, right? You laugh. Have any of you been to a synagogue? Some of them will have a screen. The women sit on this side behind the screen so they can't see the men, and vice versa. Why? Well, because you don't want that distraction. You know what's going on. This is the idea behind burqas within Islam, right? Just cover her up so you don't have to see her. And there are versions of the Christian burqa. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. That is not at all what he's getting to. What he's talking about is using other people for your own gratification. It's using people, another person,
Yeah, people.
it's not seeing another person as a person. It's seeing another person for the utility that they may have that you can capitalize to gratify some desire that you have. That's what's going on here. And this is way more than just sexual, because is it possible to use another person in a manner that gratifies something that you want that has nothing to do with sex? Absolutely it is. Absolutely. So where Jesus is talking previously about murder and about despising people, showing contemptuous disdain for people, and when you have disdain and contempt for another person, well, you have already committed murder in your heart. What he's saying here is when you start looking at people as a means to your gratification as to whatever it is, sexual or not, when they're just a means to your gratification, now you have actually violated the command against adultery. Because now, instead of seeing and treating another person as someone made in the image of God, you're treating them as a tool, as a means to get you something. Now, as we've said before, and we're going to come to this again eventually, there's a relationship between people and things. And that's easily demonstrable, right? How easy is it to throw your own stuff away? How many of you had to clean your parents' place up?
It gets easier if you're moving.
Well, it gets easier if you're moving. Well, at the beginning of the process, what do you try to do?
Save everything.
And at the end of the process, what are you doing?
Throwing it all.
Throw it away, I don't want it. Right? How easy is it to throw other people's stuff away?
Very.
Yeah. Shelley stays out of my office. It's none of her business what I got in there. And I am under penalty of death to go touch anything on the shelving where the quilting and sewing material is. I mean, there's a lifetime supply of oil rags there if somebody wanted to tear all that material up. But I would lose I'd lose a lot if I touched that for that. So it's the relationship between people and stuff, or people and status. Now, is having stuff wrong? How many of you have stuff? Well, we all have stuff, right? Right. What does the world tell us about stuff?
Guy with the most stuff wins.
The guy who dies with the most toys wins. What we are taught by the world is get as much stuff as you can. You want cool stuff. You want, really, really nice stuff, right? We all want to have nice stuff. Okay, well, so what does the world tell us? In the process of getting the nicest stuff you can possibly get, what do you do with people? You use them to get it. The world teaches us to love stuff and to use people to get it. The world teaches us to love status and to use people to develop the status. That's what the world tells us. What does Jesus tell us? He said, you love people. And whatever stuff you have, you use in order to love them, to help them, to benefit them. So this is all tied in with what he's getting. So this is not a new commandment. Don't look at any, don't acknowledge, don't even be looking at billboards or anything. Just keep your eye, that's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about our heartfelt attitude towards how we view other people. and how we treat other people. And then he goes on to talk about, marriage eventually, but he gets to this place. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than you cut your whole, than that your whole body be thrown into hell. For if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body goes into hell. How many of you believe that? Everybody raise your right hand. Raise your right hands. Come on. Everybody. Sarah, you have to play. Raise your right, oh, come on, raise it up. Let's see, everybody raise them so I can see them. Come on. There's a single person in this room missing their right hand. How about that? Why the right hand?
Something of the Old Testament with the right hand and the forehead, and it's called something, but I can't remember what.
Can't remember. When you go into court as a witness, what's the first thing you have to do? Raise your right hand and do what? Take an oath to tell the truth. Why do they care what hand you raise?
See if you cut it off.
Those of you that were in the military, which hand do you salute with?
Right.
Does it matter if you're left-handed or right-handed?
Nope.
You salute with your right hand. Yeah, how come?
It shows that you're not armed, because most people are right-handed, and that's where they carry their sword.
Well, maybe. Fairly famous story in the Old Testament about somebody that was left-handed and killed the king, assassinated the king. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not armed. Why do you raise your right hand?
Because it has to do with the right, being in the right hand of God, that he talks about in the Bible there.
It's your primary hand to do everything.
Yeah, by and large, it's the most dominant hand. It is the most useful hand. The left hand, even in a lot of cultures today, is considered the unclean hand. You don't hand somebody anything with your left hand. You use your right hand because it's generally speaking the most significant, the most useful. Yes, I know for left-handed people, you got it. Okay, so here becomes the question: what would induce you to cut off your right hand?
Absolutely nothing.
Unless you had to amputate it because you were diseased.
What would induce you to cut your right hand off? Willingly, voluntarily cut your right hand off?
No other choice.
There's always another choice, Danny.
You could die. I mean, if death was involved, to do it.
So the only thing that would induce you to do that is if it would cut your right hand off or die. Those would be the. So I had, in one of my numerous finger injuries, hand injuries that I've had over the years, I caught my right hand in a machine a few years ago. Not in a saw, fortunately, but it was belts. My hand went through belts and a pulley system. Yeah, I said something like that. So I crushed these fingers, and I'm just pointing out because it's this finger. I know it's my waving finger, but I tore the end of this finger off. So it's gone. I pulled the fingernail out by the roots. Okay, it's one of the things that happens when we finally get to the emergency room. Shelley always takes pictures. Next to her sister, the nurse. Yeah. And she sends it to all the boys. Look what your dad did this time. So anyway, we got these pictures, and they are really gruesome. Where the end of my finger is gone. It's this bloody stump out here. Okay. So the doctor comes in, they do the x-ray, they do the whole bit, and then she finally says, we have to put some stitches in there. So the fingernail's gone, the end is pulpy. And I said, stitches, what are you gonna stitch up? She goes, well, I wanna stitch the skin down to try to hold it so it doesn't just come off. And she said, what's gonna happen at the end happens at the end. Okay, so she starts the stitching, I think she put, I don't remember, 12 or 14 stitches in my finger, but she can't get the needle through. She's pushing on my finger, you know, trying to thread the needle through and it won't go. And I'm like, was it needle dull? I got a Leatherman, we can sharpen it, you know.
Clean the version up, you're gonna make us sick.
There's a reason for that. Because the worst is yet to come. So no, she says I'm hitting something in there. So she reaches in the end of my finger, bloody stumped with a pair of tweezers, digs around, pulls out a bone. And she's like, well, you won't need that anymore. So she stitches around, pulls some more bone fragments out, gets it all done. Then she takes a Sharpie and she draws a ring on my finger. And I'm like, what's that for? And she said, you have to come back in here every 3 days for the next, I forget how many weeks, so we can look at this. And I said, what are you looking for? And she said, infection. You've shattered, the bone in your finger is shattered. She said, so until that heals, we have to watch this. And she said, whatever you do, keep that clean. Because if you get an infection in the bone, she said, we're gonna cut your finger off. So she had this line around my finger and I'm watching, I go, okay, so there's 0.0. What happens if we get to there? She said, we're cutting your finger off at the knuckle. And I said, oh, so what happens if it gets, she goes, then we'll cut it off at that knuckle. And I said, what if it, she goes, we'll cut your hand off. So she said, do not get an infection in that bone. I have to admit, that really motivated me. I mean, in the morning, I got up, I got really good. And you know, this is a little tricky. You ever try to bandage your own finger using your left hand? I got really good at this. I would cut the bandages off, I'd clean it out, I'd put antibiotic on it, put other medicine on. Shelley and Kristen had concocted some mixture of essential snake oil that I poured on there. Get it all wrapped up, I'd go to work. Come in at lunchtime, cut the bandage off. Clean it up as good as I could. Get it done. Put the bandage, rebandage it. Come in after work. Take the bandage off. Clean it up. I was really motivated. You know, now, normally when a guy cuts himself, what does he do? Duct tape, man, duct tape. Man, yeah, rub some dirt in it, because then that clots it up, yeah. Man, I'm making sure that I don't get an infection in his bone because I don't want to lose my finger. And so I'm running in every couple of days and on the band, they go, okay, and they're watching this redness grow. And you know, if it gets to that line, you know, we're getting, you know, they cut a finger off with a cigar cutter. Anyways, you don't want to know why I know that. But I was motivated to keep my hand. What would it take for you to voluntarily cut your hand off?
Double dog beer.
Life-threatening, because, you know, if it gets infected, I go, no, you can't cut my finger off, and it just goes on, no, you can't cut my hand off, no, you can't cut my arm off. Eventually, you know, don't have to worry about cutting anything off. That'll be the end of it. It's serious matter. So when Jesus says, if this offends you, cut it off. And we haven't even talked about gouging an eye out yet. What would it take to motivate you to voluntarily lose your right eye? This is the seriousness that when he says, you know, if this happens, cut it off, gouge it out. What's the it that he's talking about? It's the sin. This is the magnitude of seriousness that we need to give gouging out and getting rid of sin in our lives. How serious are we about dealing with sinful habits in our lives? Well, that's pretty passionate, isn't it? Whatever, if the only reason you cut your right hand off is in a life and death situation, the only way you can conceive of doing it, how much more serious is it to deal with sin in our lives? It's life and death in an eternal sense is what Jesus is saying. Because man, better off that you maim yourself rather than go into hell for all eternity with your whole body intact. That becomes the magnitude of the seriousness of the sin. The sin comes back where he starts is adultery, but what he's really talking about too, tied into this, is covetousness. See, we keep coming back to the Ten Commandments. They're pretty important. Covetousness. Which commandment do you always break first out of the 10?
That one.
That one. Number 10. You cannot break 1 through 9 without first violating commandment number 10. Thou shalt not covet. And it's interesting because when the commandment comes, when Jesus or God says from Mount Sinai, thou shalt not covet, Moses gives the explanation. Covet what?
Anything.
All your neighbor's stuff. Talks about his wife, talks about his servants, talks about his animals, talks about his land. Covetousness is way more than just sexual desire, although you can't commit adultery without first coveting. That which you desire, that which you have no business desiring. So this is where he's tying them together. And we are to be serious, he said, about cutting the sin out of our lives. We are to be that serious about it. Eradicating it. How serious are we today in the church about eradicating sinfulness? How serious are we in our lives about eradicating sinful tendencies and behaviors?
We're forgiven. God loves us.
God loves us. Christ died for me. God doesn't want me to be unhappy, does he? So he goes on. We'll get started on this. So then he goes on from this, and he said, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So right after adultery, we get to divorce, the second most popular topic in any evangelical church. This'll earn me friends, I'm sure. I'll explain what Jesus is talking about here in terms of his whole view of divorce. Now, in Matthew chapter 19, well, let me ask first off, was divorce permitted in the Old Testament?
Yes.
Yes, it was. Why? Exactly, because Jesus is talking about it. He said, there it is. Because of the hardness of your heart. It was a concession God gave. Because we are hard-hearted, stiff-necked people. And this is one of the areas where our hard-heartedness and our stiff necks is demonstrated. So there was provision that allowed for divorce, for the termination of divorce. Now, couple decide they want to get divorced. So what becomes the question then that's asked?
Who gets the stuff?
Even before they start fighting over this stuff.
Whose fault?
Why? Whose fault is it?
Yeah.
And whose fault is it always? The other person's. Right. Sometimes you talk to people, there's a token of, okay, maybe I wasn't as good as I should have been, but, and then the other person's this big jerk, okay, for whatever reason. So even within Jewish law, the provision for divorce was, again, really broad. There was a whole spectrum. Under what conditions could you get divorced according to the Sadducees and Pharisees? Well, one school of thought had it down to the only reason you could possibly get a divorce, terminate a marriage, is if on your wedding night you found out your wife was not a virgin. She'd been with someone else. Next morning you got the right to divorce her. There's a window of time, you don't take advantage of it, you're out of luck. You're stuck with her for the rest of your life. The other end of the spectrum was, if she does anything to displease you, literally, if you burn the toast, you have a bad breakfast, get a little mouthy with you, you're not pleased, you just don't like her anymore. All you gotta do is say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and she could leave. And you could even say she could pack up her stuff and leave, but she didn't get to pack up any stuff. She just got the boot. All right? That was the spectrum that came within in Jesus' day as to what and how divorce was justified. So Jesus narrows it down a whole lot. He just said, yeah, you've heard it said that if anybody's going to get a divorce, give her a certificate of divorce. Why was the certificate of divorce required and important?
I suppose so everybody would know she wasn't divorced.
Partly.
Is it the same?
Moses said you have to give her a certificate of divorce. Now think about that in the ancient world. You have to give her a certificate of divorce.
So she's released from the husband's control.
Yeah, but why the certificate?
Does he have to have somebody and it's written somewhere?
So she can glean the fields of food?
How long does it take you to write a certificate of divorce in the ancient world?
With a stone tablet, like a chisel?
Yeah. By the time you get done with your name and her name, it's like, we may as well just stay married because this is going to take forever. Although, being smart, but the idea was it prevents spurious divorces. Now let's admit it here, everybody that's married. Have you ever looked at your spouse one afternoon and said,
Careful now.
I know. Honey, I love you so much. Right? Okay, we all have times where you're like, just go away. And I know, because she says that to me once in a while. Go to your room and don't come out until I tell you you can. No, of course, we all get times where you're just like, oh, done with you. You know, hour or two later, things settle down, you figure out what's wrong, and you take care of it. But part of the idea is that it would prevent spur-of-the-moment divorces. That this was not something that was to be undertaken lightly, spuriously, emotionally. If you're going to do this, okay, because of the hardness of your heart, we will permit it. But there's going to be a process. You're not going to just be able to do it off the cuff. It's going to take some time here in order to get this all accomplished. And then, yes, it was a defense for the woman then that she said, my husband, I've got the certificate of divorce. Yes, we were married, but I got the certificate of divorce. And so under certain circumstances, in the Old Testament law, she was allowed to remarry. Jesus makes it a lot narrower than that. And of course, and this is, and I realize this is going to ruffle some feathers. Well, why that boat has sailed, I've done that. I'm worried about that. What does the word Jesus use mean? Where he says, I say to everyone who divorces his wife except on the grounds of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. In other words, he gives one justification for divorce. Just one. Now the question is, how expansive is this word? Jesus has multiple words at his disposal. And so the word for adultery, where it says, you've heard it said, except for adultery, that's one word. He uses a different word where he talks about sexual immorality. And so then the question is, how expansive is the definition of that word? And even to this day, even amongst evangelical scholars, there's not a lot of agreement. You can't find those good biblical scholars, good solid evangelicals, whose names would be respected if I said them, take a very, 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 very narrow view of divorce, under just some really, really narrow parameters can divorce be justified, and they use this verse to do it. On the other hand, there are those that take a little bit broader view, quoting Paul. And then, of course, you always get this, well, wait a minute. Some jerk of a guy, and guys can be jerks, some jerk of a guy is a drunk, abusive husband beating the daylights out of his wife constantly. You mean she's supposed to stay in that? Because spousal abuse isn't covered in that very specific sense here. So this is where we need to be a little bit careful, because this is a simple debating technique which gets used, and you can hear it in law cases. In fact, it's what justified Roe versus Wade. So, the original court case. What happens is you have a situation, bad situation, but you take the most extreme example of that. Then you take that extreme example and you say, this by itself is the justification. And you make the extreme situation the norm. And then use the norm to justify the entire issue. Okay? And if you've ever taken debate classes, it's just a simple sophomoric debating technique that you can use to win arguments. And I know how to win arguments. So that was the situation that justified Roe versus Wade. They took this extreme situation of a single mother under horrific conditions and blah, 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 and said, look, this lady, needs to be able to get an abortion. And so the courts justified it based on the extreme. But then what happened? The extreme became the norm. They used that justification to justify abortion on demand under almost any circumstances. So it's a logical trick. Divorce, same thing. So they will take an extreme example. The poor woman with no other options who's married to a drunken bum who beats the daylights out of her. You mean she shouldn't be able to get a divorce? And if you say no, what are you? A heartless misogynist, hates women. If you say yes to that, then you say, oh, okay, so now divorce is justified, right? Any reason, doesn't matter. We don't love each other anymore. We don't like each other anymore. Well, to that I want to say, so grow up. And so the whole justification for divorce becomes just convoluted today. And it comes back to this. Is marriage a covenant or is marriage a contract? Why do I enter a contract? Why do I enter a contract with anybody for anything?
For my own protection.
Because I'm getting something out of it that I want. Yeah. The only reason that I'm going to enter a contract with anybody is there's something in it for me. I want it. Now I look at, okay, before I sign the contract, get into it, doesn't matter what it is. I look, okay, what am I going to get out of this? What's it going to cost me? And am I willing to pay this in order to get this? And if the answer is yes, I enter the contract. And if the answer is no, I don't. All right? Simple enough. We're all familiar with contracts. We've all signed different kinds of contracts. Why do you enter a covenant?
To give something.
Who benefits from the covenant?
The other person.
The other person benefits from the covenant. I enter covenants not for my own benefit. I enter covenants for the other person's benefit. There we are. That's the first one. I can go 5 minutes over. So, yeah, I enter covenant for someone else's benefit, not my benefit. I don't ask the question, what do I get out of this? So within that covenant relationship then, the question is, what am I going to give and what am I going to do? And it's always about the other person. Marriage is fundamentally a covenant. It's not a contract. Now, plenty of contractual marriages in this world. People went in, they stay in it until, hey, because what happens in a contract? If I don't get what I want, what do? I get out of the contract. Use it as the justification. Right? But in the covenant, I'm there. The covenant binds. I am there to give to the other person. Now, what if the other person doesn't want it anymore? Doesn't matter. You still keep giving it. Now, if the other person doesn't live up to to the covenant, how does that affect you?
Makes you miserable, but you can't do.
But you don't. Okay. God makes a covenant with Abraham, right? The Abrahamic covenant. Did Abraham live up to everything he was supposed to do? Did God walk away from the covenant?
No.
There you are. That's why covenants and that's why marriage is so vital, and it is given in its spiritual dimension. Because you look at all of this. Marriage is one of the metaphors God uses to show what our relationship to Him is like. Not in a contractual sense, in the covenant sense. And you can look at this all through the Old Testament, all of the issues that were there. Any of you ever read the Old Testament book of Hosea? Remember that swell wife he had? There are plenty of places in the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah where some fairly graphic sexual terms get used to describe Israel in her unfaithfulness to God. Did God abandon Israel? No. So one of the reasons this becomes such a vital thing is because it's one of the ways that God's presence in His relationship is demonstrated in a tangible way. That's why Jesus takes such some say harsh view. I don't think it's harsh. I think it's a strong view on the whole nature of divorce and remarriage. Now, ultimately, that's the issue. The issue isn't always divorce. The real issue is, under what circumstances can you, if any, be remarried? So that's where part of the answer lies in terms of you're going to make this poor abused woman stay in this relationship the whole rest of her life. No, there are other answers. It's not an either or. There's other options here that can be dealt with. So, but in a marriage relationship like that, what's happening? One person is using the other person for their gratification. That's what the core problem is. One person is using another person for whatever justification for their own personal gratification. And that is the attitude that Jesus condemns. When He says, you have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say to you, anybody that looks on a person in order to develop inappropriate desire the conditions are already there, just the opportunity hasn't. That is His explanation of adultery and marriage. But this principle goes beyond, way beyond, merely marriage and sexuality. If the root problem is covetousness, and that's what we've got to be looking at, the inordinate desire for stuff, the inordinate desire to use somebody else in an inappropriate way. Any of you ever buy anything online? Isn't it easy? Isn't it easy to go on there and just start clicking? Oh man, that looks cool. Click, get one of them. Oh, that looks cool. Click, get one of them. Oh, that looks cool. Oh, I didn't know I needed one of those so bad, but I just discovered that I need one so bad. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe the prohibition on covetousness, when we understand it, certainly is illustrated strongly in adultery, but maybe it goes way beyond adultery. And that the idea of I want the stuff and I'm going to use people to get it is the heart attitude that Jesus is talking about. And he's saying, look, this is so serious that you should approach eradicating it in your life with the same seriousness that you would make a decision between, do I cut my hand off or do I die? All right, that was the bell. Let's close. Father, we thank you for your words. They can be hard to hear. But help us, Lord, to understand that while this even sounds impossible and beyond us and we can despair, by the power of your Spirit, by your grace and mercy, this can be a real experience in our lives. That we would see sin dead at our feet if we appeal to your strength and ability. May the words that have been said today take root in our heart. May it bear fruit that pleases you. May the worship service ahead be pleasing in your sight. So we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.